April 24, 1943. Point 174, Tunisia. On an arid hill overlooking the road to Tunis and the Medjida River Valley, a massive tank weighing 57 tons stood in a commanding position, its 725mm wide tracks digging deep into the rocky North African soil. Panzerkampfwagen VI Tiger, number 131 of schwere Panzer. Abteilung 504 had been fighting fiercely for 2 days against elements of 4 battalions of Churchill tanks and 6 battalions of British infantry. Its 88mm KWK-36 gun, capable of penetrating 100mm of armor at 2,000 meters, had wreaked havoc among Allied units, attempting to capture this strategic position. Then came the lucky shot that would change the history of Allied armored intelligence. 57mm shell fired from a Churchill tank, probably on the move and at considerable distance, struck the underside of the Tiger's 88mm gun barrel, ricocheted upward, and lodged itself in the turret ring. This relatively modest projectile, normally incapable of penetrating the Tiger's massive armor, had found the only vulnerable point that truly mattered at that precise moment. The turret immediately jammed, unable to traverse. The weld on the upper plate split under the impact. The radio was shattered by the vibrations. Evidence suggests the driver and bow gunner may have been incapacitated by the shock. The German crew, already worn down by 2 days of intense combat, and probably inexperienced according to the unit's war diary, which notes, with some shame, that crew members of Tiger 131 panic and abandon the tank after 2 harmless hits from a Churchill hastily evacuated their immobilized machine. They fled, leaving behind the first intact Panzerkampfwagen VI Tiger IV to fall into Allied hands. Private John Oscroft of the 2nd Battalion, the Sherwood Foresters, carrying his unit's unreliable Piat anti-tank weapon, had crawled dangerously close to the German monster moments earlier. He had aimed carefully and fired, only to watch his bomb strike a glancing blow on the turret and bounce off harmlessly. At that moment, he saw the massive turret begin to traverse in his direction and decided, quite sensibly, to get his head down and pray. Fortune smiled on him when the Churchill's lucky shot struck home moments later, and the Tiger's crew bailed out and made off across the hillside. The abandoned Tiger sat there on point 174, a 57-ton trophy of incalculable intelligence value, waiting to reveal secrets that would profoundly impact Allied understanding of German armored capabilities and design philosophy. To understand the significance of Tiger 131's capture, one must first grasp the desperate situation British tank crews faced in Tunisia during early 1943. Lieutenant Peter Goodgin of the 48th Royal Tank Regiment, who would later play a controversial role in Tiger 131's story, arrived in Tunisia with his unit in April 1943. What greeted them was a most discouraging sight. See stacked Churchill tank hulks with large holes punched through even their thickest armor. British tankers knew they were outgunned and out-armored. The Churchill infantry tank, while possessing excellent cross-country mobility and relatively thick armor for its time, mounted only a 6-pounder gun that struggled to penetrate German medium tanks at combat ranges, let alone the rumored new heavy tank whose reputation had spread through the Allied ranks like wildfire since its first appearance in Tunisia in January 1943. Intelligence about this fearsome opponent remained fragmentary and often contradictory. German crews had been thorough in carrying out orders to completely destroy abandoned Tigers to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. As a result, little was known about this formidable new opponent beyond alarming combat reports and the occasional glimpse of wreckage too damaged to yield useful technical intelligence. British tank crews went into combat knowing their Churchill tanks were comparatively undergunned and that they would be no match for Tigers when they eventually met. Yet this knowledge did not deter them from conducting their duty with almost casual daily acts of considerable personal courage. When Lieutenant Goodgin's troop advanced toward German positions at Jebel Jaffa on April 21, 1943, he experienced the Tiger's destructive power firsthand. As we advanced towards our objectives, we could see no sign of the enemy, Goodgin later recalled. But suddenly my fellow troop leader's tank erupted in an enormous explosion. Before I had chance to locate the source of this shot, my tank was hit by a shot which passed through the front plate, through the fighting compartment, and into the engine, setting it ablaze. Gudgin and his crew bailed out under heavy machine gun fire and were fortunate to escape with minor injuries. The crew of the other tank were all killed. The next day, examining his burnt-out tank, Gudgin noted it had been cleanly penetrated by an 88mm shell. For decades afterward, he would mistakenly believe that Tiger 131 was the same tank that had destroyed his Churchill, a belief that would create lasting confusion about the circumstances of the famous tank's capture. The truth, as research by Dale Oscroft and others would eventually reveal, was that Tiger 131 was actually disabled 15 miles away from Jebel Jaffa at point 174 during the Sherwood Foresters' attack on April 24th, not by Gudgin's unit at all. Engineers arrived at point 174 on May 6, 1943, as the final Allied offensive in Tunisia gathered momentum. What they found was a battle-scarred veteran tank bearing visible evidence of extensive combat damage. High explosive shells had scarred the cupola, the upper edge of the turret, the mantlet and the driver's plate, particularly to the main armament's left side. The topmost smoke discharger on the turret's left side was missing entirely. Multiple 6-pounder hits were evident, one on the right-hand turret lifting stud, another that had smashed through the open loader's hatch, deflecting to hit the hatch rim and potentially injuring crew members inside, but critically, the tank was largely intact and potentially restorable to running condition. Tiger 131 was recovered by the workshop, serving the same 2 brigades of Churchill tanks that had fought against it. This workshop operated in the open air on a small plain, a few miles southwest of the battlefield, working under the North African sun with limited proper documentation or technical manuals for German equipment. The restoration demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and resourcefulness by British technicians who had to work out German engineering solutions through practical investigation and intelligent reverse engineering automotively. Tiger 131 needed little more than fluids. The Maybach HL230 P45 V12 gasoline engine, producing 700 horsepower at 3,000 RPM and displacing 23 litres, had survived largely intact. The sophisticated Maybach Olvaro G40 12/16 transmission, with its 8 forward gears and 4 reverse gears, required inspection but proved functional. Turret control was partially restored by working out the burr on the turret ring that the lucky shot had created. The main structural repair was a welded plug in the buckled hull roof where the impact had deformed. The armor plate, the damaged hatches in the turret and the missing smoke discharger were replaced with parts salvaged from other Tigers that had been less fortunate. The kinetic damage to the road wheels, track guards, turret stowage bin, and centrifugal air cleaners was never fully repaired, remaining as permanent testimony to the tank's combat history. The restoration was probably scheduled around a visit on May 14th by the commander of First Army and technicians from regional commands who wanted to inspect this prize capture. At the same time, an Army film and photographic unit filmed Tiger 131 running around a cross-country course and posing behind cover. The film would be used both to train soldiers in recognition of the type and to propagandize its supposed flaws, though the latter purpose would prove somewhat dishonest given what testing would eventually reveal about the Tiger's genuine capabilities. Tiger 131 spent the rest of May corralled with other captured equipment for casual inspection by personnel camped nearby or passing through. On May 24th, it was driven to Tunis for display before very special visitors. On June 2, 1943, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrived to inspect the captured Tiger, accompanied by Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, General Harold Alexander of 18th Army Group, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson of First Army. Photographs captured these senior military and civilian leaders descending the front of Tiger 131, providing propaganda value that emphasized Allied success in North Africa. King George VI himself visited on June 18, 1943. Such was the importance attached to this capture. The message was clear. The supposedly invincible German superweapon had been defeated and captured by British forces, and Britain's highest civilian and military leadership wanted to be photographed with this trophy. In late May, emblems were painted on Tiger 131 to commemorate its capture. First Army's shield in white with the Red Cross of St. George and a sword, and 25th Tank Brigade's sign consisting of two black triangles opposed vertically. These emblems would later be painted over decades afterward, when Lieutenant Gudgeon's incorrect attribution of the capture to his own unit gained acceptance at the Tank Museum, creating historical confusion that would persist until the 21st century. Technicians had urged Home authorities to get Tiger 131 to Britain since May. But shipping priorities in the middle of a world war meant the tank waited months with no particular urgency. The delay did provide more time for Major A. Douglas, Lidderdale of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, who had commanded the workshop that recovered and restored the tank, to collect additional equipment and draft a comprehensive report on his findings. Tiger 131 was transferred between various inappropriate ports and ships until it finally left Tunisian waters on September 20th, 1943, resting atop a cargo of iron ore. After one stop in Gibraltar, it reached Glasgow on October 8th, ironically, arriving at the British port furthest from its intended destination in southern England. The equipment reached the Department of Tank Design at Chobham Heath in Surrey on October 19th. Tiger 131 itself, along with Major Lidderdale, reached the School of Tank Technology at Chobham on October 20th, 1943. Both institutions were departments of the Ministry of Supply, and they would now cooperate in the exploitation of Tiger 131, though in a distracted and chaotic manner that would last into 1945 without ever achieving complete documentation. Lidderdale completed his draft report as the first official report in November 1943, but Tiger 131 was immediately diverted again for political and propagandistic purposes. On November 15th, it was carried to London for another audience with the Prime Minister, even though Churchill had already quietly travelled overseas. Then it embarked on a tour of British cities as part of a campaign to raise funds for the war effort, before returning to Chobham a few days before 1944, by which time its guardians were on leave. The testing and documentation would prove frustratingly incomplete and poorly organized. By the time serious technical evaluation could begin, the Department of Tank Design and School of Tank Technology were preoccupied with development and trials of Allied tanks and variants in preparation for the invasion of Northwest Europe, scheduled for June 1944. This competing priority helps explain why junior officers from the Royal Tank Regiment and Royal Armoured Corps, rather than specialized technical branches, were assigned to write many reports. Lieutenant Peter Gudgeon, invalided home from Tunisia, and awaiting a course at the School of Tank Technology, authored several internal reports published in January 1944, covering fighting arrangements and stowage. He would decades later claim that Tiger 131 was the Tiger that had destroyed his tank, an assertion that was incorrect but gained wide acceptance. His amendments to Lidderdale's documents, relocating the place of recovery to conform with his own battle and recaptioning photographs, would create lasting historical confusion. The investigation proceeded at glacial pace without any surviving master plan, though clearly the reporters worked to some organizational scheme. Report numbers and section numbers were reserved for documents that were never completed. Some reports were commissioned opportunistically rather than systematically. The inertia starter, for instance, was the first automotive part to be reported, even though the engine, gearbox and steering had been identified in Tunisia as most advanced and worthy of immediate attention. Reports continued sporadically through 1944. The first report on the Maybach HL230 engine didn't appear until September 1944, and it was merely a short general description. A detailed description followed later, possibly in 1945. Sections on the dynamo and inertia start were completed, but planned sections were never written. Critically, no mobility trials were possible after the engine and a suspension arm broke in March 1944. They were never repaired, limiting the scope of evaluation that could be conducted. This represented a significant loss of intelligence opportunity, as mobility characteristics were among the most important performance parameters for a tank. By September 1944, When final reports on special devices and equipment were completed, the intelligence was too late to influence wartime Allied tank design in any meaningful way. More frustratingly, no evidence suggests that Allied tank designers particularly cared to be influenced by what had been learned. Western allies knew considerably more about the Tiger by 1944 than they had in 1943, yet Western tanks changed little in fundamental design philosophy. Despite the incomplete and poorly organized documentation, the testing of Tiger 131 revealed crucial information about German armored design philosophy and capabilities that profoundly impacted Allied understanding. Even if it didn't substantially change Allied tank design during the war, the armor protection impressed and concerned British evaluators. The Tiger's frontal armor measured 100 millimeters thick on the hull front, angled at approximately 10 degrees from vertical, providing effective thickness of roughly 101 millimeters against direct fire. The turret front armor measured 100 millimeters as well, with the gun mantlet providing an additional 100 to 110 millimeters, creating an exceptionally well-protected frontal aspect that was effectively immune to most Allied tank guns at combat ranges. Side armor measured 80 millimeters on both hull and turret, substantially thicker than any Allied tank's side protection. Even the rear armor, at 80 millimeters on the hull, exceeded the frontal armor of most Allied tanks. The Tiger was essentially a mobile fortress that could shrug off hits that would destroy lighter tanks. The 88 millimeters KWK-36 L56 gun, adapted from the famous Flak 1836 anti-aircraft gun, proved devastatingly effective in the anti-tank role, firing armor-piercing rounds at 773 meters per second muzzle velocity. It could penetrate 100 millimeters of armor, angled at 30 degrees from 2,000 meters distance. At typical combat ranges of 1,000 meters or less, it could penetrate virtually any Allied tank from any angle. The gun's excellent optics, including the Turmzielfernrohr 9B binocular sight with 2.5x magnification, enabled first-round hits at ranges where Allied tanks struggled to identify targets. British firing trials against captured Tiger armor plates confirmed what combat reports had indicated. Existing British tank guns were inadequate against this level of protection. The 6-pounder gun that equipped most British tanks could only penetrate Tiger's frontal armor at ranges under 500 meters with specialized ammunition, and even then only under optimal conditions. The 75mm gun on later Churchills fared little better. Only the 17-pounder gun, just entering service in 1944, could reliably engage Tigers at reasonable combat ranges. The Maybach HL230 P45 engine, while powerful at 700 horsepower, revealed some concerning characteristics. It was complex, requiring considerable maintenance and skilled mechanics to keep operational. Fuel consumption was prodigious, with the Tiger consuming approximately 500 liters of gasoline per 100 kilometers on roads, and even more cross-country. The 8-speed transmission, while sophisticated and theoretically allowing fine control of ground speed, was complex and prone to failure under the stress of the Tiger's immense weight. The interleaved road wheel suspension system, using overlapping wheels arranged in a complex pattern, provided excellent cross-country mobility and a relatively smooth ride despite the tank's weight. However, British engineers noted immediately that this system had serious operational drawbacks. In muddy or winter conditions, mud and ice could freeze between the wheels, completely immobilizing the tank until thawed. Replacing a damaged inner road wheel required removing multiple outer wheels first, making field repairs extremely time-consuming. The Tiger's ground pressure, at approximately 1.04 kilograms per square centimeter, was actually lower than many lighter tanks due to its very wide tracks. This gave it surprisingly good mobility across soft ground, though its 57-ton weight still limited its ability to cross many bridges that lighter tanks could use safely. Automotive performance testing, limited though it was before the engine failure, revealed a tank that was ponderous but not immobile. Maximum road speed was approximately 38 kilometers per hour on level roads, respectable for such a heavy vehicle, but slower than most Allied medium tanks. Cross-country speed was considerably slower, typically 15 to 20 kilometers per hour, and fuel consumption at these speeds was catastrophic. British evaluators noted that the Tiger represented a fundamentally different design philosophy from Allied tanks. Where British and American designers had generally prioritized mobility, mechanical reliability, and ease of production and maintenance, German designers had prioritized firepower and protection above all else, accepting compromises in mobility, complexity, and logistical burden. The testing of Tiger 131 provided concrete, undeniable confirmation of what British tank crews already knew from bitter combat experience. They were fighting in inferior machines against a technically superior opponent. This knowledge had profound psychological impact on British armoured forces that extended well beyond simple tactical considerations. Lieutenant Gudgeon's experience was typical of British tankers in Tunisia. After watching his fellow troop leader's tank erupt in a massive explosion from a single Tiger hit, then having his own tank penetrated through the frontal armour and set ablaze, he understood viscerally that British tanks were outmatched. The sight of stacked Churchill hulks with massive holes punched through their thickest armour reinforced this brutal reality for every British tanker arriving in theatre. Yet British tank crews continued to close with and engage Tigers, despite knowing the odds were heavily against them. The capture of Tiger 131 itself resulted from British tank crews methodically engaging the Tiger with multiple hits, achieving the lucky shot that jammed its turret through sheer volume of fire and high gunnery standards that enabled hitting a moving target at distance while themselves moving. This required extraordinary courage bordering on fatalism. The testing program revealed that this courage was not misplaced, even though British tanks were technically inferior. The Tiger, despite its formidable capabilities, was not invincible. It could be disabled by lucky hits on vulnerable points. Its complexity made it mechanically unreliable. Its weight limited mobility. Its fuel consumption was unsustainable in extended operations. An inexperienced or demoralized crew could be induced to abandon a technically functional tank. British tankers learned through the testing program that Tigers could be defeated through superior tactics, numerical superiority, and exploiting the Tiger's operational limitations, even if they couldn't match it gun for gun or armor for armor in direct engagement. The intelligence gathered from Tiger 131 should have fundamentally influenced British tank design, but it largely didn't, for reasons that reveal much about the challenges of incorporating battlefield lessons into weapons development during wartime. British designers were already aware by late 1943 that their tanks were outgunned by the best German armor. The Challenger tank mounting the 17-pounder gun was in development, and the Firefly conversion putting 17-pounders in Sherman chassis was being rushed into production. These programs continued and accelerated, but no fundamental rethinking of British armour philosophy occurred. The reasons were pragmatic and unforgiving. British tank production was already committed to existing designs. Retooling factories to produce entirely new designs would cause production gaps that frontline units couldn't afford. The Sherman tank, provided in vast quantities under Lend-Lease from America, was adequate for most tactical situations, even if outmatched by Tigers. And Tigers were rare enough that designing British tanks specifically to counter them seemed uneconomical when those same British tanks would spend most of their service engaging more common German armour like Panzer truffles. Most fundamentally, Britain lacked the industrial capacity to produce tanks comparable to the Tiger in similar numbers. The Tiger cost approximately 300,000 Reichsmarks to produce and required 300,000 man-hours of labour. Germany produced only 1,347 Tiger Is during the entire war, from August 1942 to August 1944. Britain could produce greater numbers of less capable tanks and win through numerical superiority, which proved strategically sound, even if tactically frustrating for individual tank crews facing Tigers. The testing did influence British anti-tank doctrine and tactics. Recognition that existing tank guns were inadequate against Tigers reinforced the importance of heavy anti-tank guns, air support, and artillery in defeating German heavy armour. Tank crews learned to engage Tigers from flanks and rear when possible, to use terrain and combined arms tactics rather than accepting direct frontal engagements, and to recognize situations where discretion was the better part of valor. The story of Tiger 131 became mired in controversy and historical confusion that persisted for decades, revealing how difficult it can be to establish accurate historical records even for well-documented events. Lieutenant Peter Gudgeon's sincere but mistaken belief that Tiger 131 was the Tiger that destroyed his tank led him to amend historical documents, recaption photographs, and influence the Tank Museum to paint out the emblems of the actual captors and credit his own unit instead. His versions of events appeared in books published as recently as 2011 by the Tank Museum itself, despite contradicting the wartime documentation. Only in the 21st century did Dale Oscroft, son of Sherwood Forester John Oscroft, who had actually fought at Point 174, begin research that would eventually prove the true story. Using wartime maps, photographs, documents, and eventually satellite imagery, with the assistance of Tiger tank expert David Burden, Oscroft demonstrated conclusively that Tiger 131 was captured at Point 174, not at Jebel Jaffa, as Gudgeon had claimed. The Tank Museum conducted tests in 2017 that confirmed the shell that disabled Tiger 131 had been fired from a Churchill tank, supporting the Sherwood Foresters from considerable distance behind the infantry, not by Gudgeon's unit 15 miles away. The museum publicly corrected the historical record, acknowledging that previous accounts had been incorrect. This episode demonstrates how historical narratives can become entrenched despite contradicting primary evidence, particularly when championed by persuasive individuals with direct wartime experience, even when their memories are honestly mistaken. Tiger 131 never returned to combat duty after its capture. Following the incomplete testing program, it was placed in storage, eventually becoming part of the collection at the Tank Museum in Bovington, England, where it remains to this day. In the 1990s, the Tank Museum undertook a comprehensive restoration to return Tiger 131 to running condition, making it the only operational Tiger I tank in the world. The restoration required fabricating numerous parts from scratch, as original German components were unavailable. The Maybach engine was rebuilt, using techniques and materials unavailable during wartime testing. The tracks, transmission, and other mechanical systems were restored to functionality. Since its restoration, Tiger 131 has been demonstrated regularly at the Tank Museum's events, allowing modern audiences to see and hear this historic tank in motion. The sight and sound of the 700-horsepower Maybach engine, driving 57 tons of German armor across the demonstration ground, provides visceral understanding of what Allied tank crews faced, that no amount of written description can convey. For historians and enthusiasts, Tiger 131 represents invaluable physical evidence of German armored design philosophy and wartime engineering capabilities. Every component, from the massive 80 mm gun to the complex interleaved suspension to the sophisticated transmission, tells a story about German priorities, capabilities, and the challenges of producing such complex machines under wartime conditions. For veterans and their descendants, Tiger 131 represents both a trophy of Allied success in North Africa and a memorial to those who fought against such formidable machines in technically inferior tanks. The courage required to close with and engage Tigers in Churchills or Shermans, knowing the odds were heavily against survival, deserves remembrance and respect. The controversies about its capture, rather than diminishing the tank's historical significance, actually enhance it by demonstrating how difficult historical truth can be to establish and maintain even for well-documented events. The eventual correction of the historical record through Dale Oscroft's patient research demonstrates that truth can prevail over comfortable but incorrect narratives, even when decades have passed. Tiger 131's capture and testing provided the Allies with invaluable intelligence about one of the war's most fearsome weapons. The British learned that Tigers were indeed formidable machines, with capabilities that exceeded Allied tanks in firepower and protection, but also that they were not invincible superweapons immune to defeat. The testing revealed a tank that represented the pinnacle of German armored engineering within a particular design philosophy, but also one that embodied the limitations of that philosophy. The Tiger was complex, expensive, mechanically unreliable, logistically burdensome, and produced in numbers far too small to be strategically decisive. It represented the German tendency toward perfectionism and technical sophistication over pragmatic mass production, a tendency that would ultimately contribute to Germany's defeat. British and American tanks were generally inferior to the Tiger in direct combat, but they were reliable, easy to maintain, produced in overwhelming numbers, and adequate for the vast majority of tactical situations. The Western Allies won the war not by matching German tanks gun for gun and armor for armor, but by producing more tanks, training more crews, establishing better logistics, and employing combined arms tactics that negated German technical advantages. Tiger 131 stands today as testimony to both German engineering prowess and the ultimate futility of technical excellence, divorced from strategic reality. It is a monument to the men who fought in it, against it, captured it and studied it, and it remains 8 decades after its capture, the only place in the world where one can see a Tiger tank move under its own power, hear its engine roar and understand, however imperfectly, what it meant to face such a machine across a battlefield. The courage of British tank crews who engaged Tigers despite knowing they were outmatched deserves eternal recognition. So does the ingenuity of the engineers and technicians who recovered, restored and tested Tiger 131 under difficult conditions. And so does the patient historical research that eventually established the true story of its capture, correcting decades of well-intentioned but incorrect accounts. Tiger 131 is more than just a tank. It is a physical connection to one of history's most destructive conflicts, a teacher that continues to educate new generations about armored warfare, and a memorial to all who fought in the North African campaign, regardless of which side they served. Its preservation and continued operation ensure that future generations can learn these lessons and remember these sacrifices.